The first time most people saw Elisa Bridges, she was a rectangle, glossy paper, centerfold, December 1994. The last time anyone saw her, she was another rectangle in Benedict Canyon, a guest room doorway, a bed, a body the industry had already filed away. Between those two frames stretches a life that, on paper, looks like a neat little paragraph. Name, dates, birthplace. A list of titles that all mean the same thing. A camera pointed at her and a culture that devoured the results. Off paper, it is messier and quieter and lonelier than the photographs ever allowed to show. On the morning news in Los Angeles, her death was a ticker line between traffic and weather. Former model found dead at 28. No signs of foul play. The cameras drove up into the hills and panned over the curve of Benedict Canyon, the kind of address that appears in real estate fantasies and crime shows. They never went inside the guest room. They did not show the way the sunlight came in through the blinds and sliced the space into bars. They did not linger on the stillness of a borrowed bed in a borrowed house where a woman whose face had once sold millions of magazines lay utterly surplus to requirements. Somewhere in the city that morning, someone saw the headline, frowned for a second, and then realized they recognized the picture. Not because they knew her, but because the image was familiar in the way advertising is familiar. You have seen it 1,000 times without remembering when. Didn't she used to be in? And then the coffee finished brewing. The kids needed shoes. The freeway backed up, and the rectangle on the screen disappeared into the churn of everything else. The rectangle is the smallest unit of desire in late 20th century America. Billboards, TV screens, VHS tapes, magazine covers behind plastic at gas stations, bedroom windows leaking blue light from late-night cable. Every pathway into and out of fame for a woman like Elisa passed through a frame. Long before she crossed the threshold of the Playboy mansion, she had already learned what it meant to be looked at more than listened to. It started, as it so often does, with small rectangles, school portrait photos, Polaroids at pool parties. Snapshots passed around by boys who turned her into a story before she had any control over the plot. None of those early rectangles carried her name. They carried labels. Hot, cute, body, that one girl from that one party. Growing up in the bland promise of American suburbia, she was the sort of girl adults shook their heads about. She's going to break hearts one day, as if she were a weather pattern rather than a person. The compliment was also a warning. It did not ask what she wanted to do or what she was good at, or what frightened her. It told her long before she had the words to articulate it that her main job in the world would be to be seen. The culture she came of age in was just beginning to industrialize a particular version of femininity. The blonde fantasy, tan skin, big hair, easy smile, a promise built into the image that nothing underneath would ever be complicated enough to inconvenience anyone. The music videos and beer commercials and sitcoms all ran on the same casting brief. If you fit the template, the world made you a kind of offer. We will pay attention to you, for a while, if you agree not to ask too many questions about what happens when we stop. There is no tidy discovery moment in Elisa's story. No mythic afternoon where a scout plucked her off a diner stool and declared her destiny. It was more banal, more bureaucratic, the way so many lives slide sideways. A friend knew a photographer. The photographer knew an agent. The agent knew someone who needed fresh faces for a local catalog. She learned how to stand under hot lights and pretend to be relaxed while strangers discussed her body like a technical problem. She learned how to keep her stomach flat and her expression open even when the pose hurt. She learned that your perfect always came with a list of things to change. In that world, the difference between anonymous pretty girl and printed image is often one word dropped into a conversation. Playboy. In the early 1990s, the brand was no longer the underground scandal of the 1950s, nor yet the full-blown nostalgia machine it would become. It was a middle-aged institution trying to stay relevant, repackaging the same fantasy with fresh faces every month. For aspiring models, it functioned like a shortcut and a trap at the same time. Instant recognition in exchange for being filed forever under one particular type of gaze. The idea arrived the way these ideas always do, as a suggestion spoken lightly, so that if you flinch it can be rewritten as a joke. Have you ever thought about testing for Playboy? Someone probably said it in a tone that implied opportunity rather than risk. For a young woman trying to pay rent and prove she wasn't just wasting time. It sounded, at least briefly, like a door, travel, professional hair and makeup, a check bigger than any she had seen. Her face on a cover people actually noticed. The price, being naked on paper, was presented as something almost trivial. It's just skin, people say, as if there is any such thing as just when you hand over your image to a machine designed to multiply it without end. The test shoots were both less glamorous and more invasive than the finished spreads suggested. Cramped studios with stained backdrops, music playing too loud to fill the awkwardness, assistants adjusting the lights, stylists worrying about tan lines, a producer talking through the beats, smile here, look serious there. Now think about someone you love. Now think about nothing at all. Off camera, Elisa was, by most accounts, shy. On set, shyness is treated as a problem to be solved, not a boundary to be respected. The machine has too much money riding on the shot to wait for someone's comfort to catch up. Somewhere in the editorial office, after those tests came back, a decision was made. She was slotted into the schedule, her name penciled in next to a month, December. Playmate of the Month sounds like a crown. It is also a countdown. The magazine has a rhythm to maintain. 12 images, 12 themes, 12 rectangles on the wall of an art director's office. For Elisa, being December meant you were the last face people would see that year. For the company, it meant nothing more or less than one more product delivered on time. December 1994 came out wrapped in plastic, stacked on convenience store shelves next to cigarettes and gummy bears. For 5 or 6 weeks, the rectangle that held her face traveled farther than she ever would. Men who would never learn her voice carried her home in grocery bags, slid her under mattresses, pinned her to garage walls. For some of them, she was a first crush. For others, a brief distraction. For most, a blur in a long sequence of interchangeable fantasies. For her, it was proof that she had done something that counted, something you could point to. Look, that's me. Not in a school yearbook, not in a family album, but on paper that strangers paid money to see. There is a story people tell about that moment. In one version, she walks past a newsstand and sees her own face for the first time among the rows of magazines. The image is bigger than life. Colors corrected, skin retouched to a texture no human actually has. For a second, she feels vertigo, as if she is looking at an older sister she never met. The clerk glances between the girl in the picture and the girl in front of him, decides they are the same, and smiles in a way that makes the whole thing feel less like an achievement and more like exposure. She buys a copy anyway, not because she needs it, but because not buying it would feel like admitting that she has done something irreversible. The problem with being Playmate of the Month is that the month ends. January arrives with a new face, a new set of measurements, a new marquee name. The archive shuffles December backward. The magazine moves on because it has to. That is the business model. Scarcity on the newsstand, abundance in the warehouse. For the company, she is now part of the back catalog. For Elisa, the shift is more disorienting, One week she is being flown to events, signing 8x10 glossies under harsh convention center lights, trying to smile through hangovers and jet lag. The next, the phone rings less often, offers narrow. A lingerie catalog here, a bar appearance there, a small role where the character description begins and ends with sexy. Some women navigate that transition with ruthless pragmatism, treating the Playmate credit as one line on a longer resume. They build brands, leverage attention into businesses, marry rich, move on. Others are eaten alive by the gap between the brief intensity of attention and the long tail of being forgettable. Elisa seems to have fallen somewhere in between. She took acting classes in anonymous office parks, practicing monologues in front of mirrors that reflected back the same body that had been printed 100,000 times, but did not offer any guidance on how to be someone else. She went to auditions where casting directors glanced at her headshot, raised an eyebrow at the Playboy line, and asked if she would be comfortable taking her top off on cable. There are only so many ways to answer that question. Yes, because saying no means no job. Yes, because you have already crossed that line in glossy print. Yes, because you are running numbers in your head. Rent, gas, groceries, health insurance that only comes with certain kinds of work. She tried to say yes enough times to stay in the game, without quite surrendering the hope that someone might one day ask her to play a person with a full range of emotions instead of a body with a first name. In between jobs, she did what so many working actresses and models do. Temp work, promotional gigs, anything that paid a little cash and kept the illusion going that this was all still part of the plan. People who knew her casually remembered one sentence more than any other. I just want to be happy. Not rich, not legendary, just happy. It sounds like a cliché until you place it in the context of her working life. Happiness in that world is always conditional, on looks, on weight, on youth, on bookings. It is something granted from the outside, withheld for reasons never fully explained. She was not an operator or a schemer. She was, by multiple accounts, soft-spoken, easily rattled, more comfortable following a plan than making one. That is an especially dangerous temperament in an industry built on ambiguity and unspoken expectations. Around her, Los Angeles kept doing what it always does, minting new faces. The late 1990s brought a wave of cable shows, music videos, and low-budget films that needed bodies to populate party scenes and bikini montages. For a while, this created a kind of second-tier ecosystem for women like Elisa. Enough work to feel busy, not enough security to feel safe. The jobs blurred together, a night shoot on a rooftop downtown, a day on a soundstage pretending to be at a pool party. A music video where the artist's name would be forgotten but the paycheck would clear. At the same time, the ground under that ecosystem was shifting. The internet cracked open the monopoly on images. What had once been scarce, the monthly centerfold, the mailed-away video, was replaced by an endless stream of free content. The brand that had treated her as both product and currency now had less use for either. Younger women cycled through faster. The age at which you became veteran shrank. At 25, a girl could already be referred to as old school. At 28, you were more likely to be asked about what you're doing now, in a tone that implied it had better be something respectable, because the culture had already decided you were done being a fantasy. There are no public records of dramatic confrontations or spectacular meltdowns in Elisa's life during this period. That, too, is part of the tragedy. Not all declines happen with fireworks. Some are just a gradual dimming of the phone. Friends noticed she was around less, or that when she was around she seemed tired in a way that sleep did not fix. She drifted between apartments, sometimes staying with friends, sometimes in places that felt temporary even when the lease said otherwise. Los Angeles is full of people who are halfway out of the industry without fully admitting it to themselves. They still go to the occasional party, still say, "I'm working on a project" when asked. They live in sublets and borrowed guest rooms, half-packed for a move that never quite happens. Elisa began to inhabit that liminal space. The rectangle followed her. Old issues of the magazine, copies of tear sheets, VHS tapes on dusty shelves, headshots in folders that never quite got updated. It is hard to reinvent yourself when every attempt at a new beginning is haunted by proof of who you were paid to be. She could have thrown it all away, of course, burned the magazines, shredded the photos, but that would have meant discarding the one clear, undeniable success her 20s had given her. So the rectangles stayed, stacked in closets and boxes, mute evidence of a moment when the world had at least agreed she existed. There is a particular cruelty in the way fame intersects with geography in Los Angeles. The same canyons that look like postcards in daylight are dotted at night with houses where people go to escape, to relapse, to disappear. On paper, the house in Benedict Canyon where she spent her last night was a place of luxury, a property owned by someone with money, a guest room offered as hospitality. In reality, it was another rectangle, 4 walls, a bed, a door that could be closed but not necessarily locked against everything that followed her in. Somewhere between the laughing at a party and the silence that came after, the line between recreational escape and lethal self-medication disappeared. The official report would later list morphine, methamphetamine, other substances with clinical names that sound almost abstract when printed in black and white. Accidental overdose is the phrase that gets attached in headlines, tidy and non-accusatory. It suggests a miscalculation, a dosage misjudged, a slip rather than a push. What it does not capture is the landscape in which that accident became possible. Years of irregular work, inconsistent support, a culture that normalizes certain kinds of numbness while pretending to be shocked when numbness turns permanent. Nobody sets out to die in a guest room. People set out to feel less, for a little while, and sometimes they overshoot. In the hours after her body was found, a familiar choreography unfolded. Police tape went up. Statements were given. Someone, somewhere, made the call to the family. News outlets pulled a file photo, always from 1994, always the most flattering angle, and attached it to a few paragraphs scraped from old press releases. The rectangle moved again, this time from the centerfold to the obituary column. Online, a stub biography acquired a new date, 2002. The internet, still young, quietly absorbed her into its endless scroll of faces and facts. One more link among millions. Rarely clicked. Meanwhile, the magazines didn't vanish. December 1994 remained in the boxes of collectors, in the back rooms of bars, in the stacks of paper that outlived the woman they portrayed. Somewhere, a teenager idly flipped through one, years after its release, and thought, "She's beautiful," without knowing she was already gone. That is the strange immortality of the rectangle. It freezes you at your most marketable while your actual life continues, or stops, off stage. The more successful the image, the easier it becomes for the person to be replaced by it. In that sense, Elisa's story is not unique. That is precisely what makes it frightening. For every famous cautionary tale with a made-for-TV arc, there are dozens of lives like hers, short bursts of visibility, followed by long stretches of being nobody's responsibility. The ecosystem that elevated her for a month had no mechanism for checking in years later. Magazines do not send follow-up letters asking how you are sleeping. Casting directors do not inquire whether you have a support network before they decide you are no longer right for the roles they're filling. Agencies are quick to return calls when your look is selling and slow to pick up when the bookings dry up. It is tempting, in stories like this, to search for a single villain, a predatory boyfriend, a monstrous executive, a specific night when everything went wrong. But Elisa's tragedy is not that kind of narrative. It is more like that rectangle of light cutting across her last room. The sum of 1,000 unremarkable decisions about which lives are considered worth following past their moment of maximum usefulness. Nobody forced her into modeling at gunpoint. Nobody forced pills down her throat. But from the first time a camera taught her that being looked at could be a way to survive. The path in front of her narrowed. There were other choices she might have made. Other jobs she could have tried. Other cities she could have moved to. Other circles she might have joined. Ordinary lives are built on those kinds of pivots. What distinguished hers was not a lack of imagination, but a lack of margin for error. The same system that paid her to embody a fantasy in her early 20s did not offer her many dignified ways to step off stage in her late 20s. Age 28 is not old in any human sense. In the world she came from, it is perilously close to the edge of the map. In interviews with other women from that era, a pattern emerges. They describe the high of the first shoot, the chaos of sudden attention, the exhaustion that follows, the realization that the calls are slowing. Some laugh it off and move on. Some reinvent themselves entirely. Some, like Elisa, drift, not because they are weaker, but because the version of themselves that was most rewarded, the smiling rectangle, has no obvious successor in the real world. It is hard to build a grounded identity on top of a foundation that was always meant to be disposable. If you look for Elisa Bridges today, you will find exactly what the rectangles have preserved: the centerfold, the occasional publicity still, a few seconds of screen time in projects where she was credited under her stage name and framed as atmosphere rather than character. You will also find the bare facts of her death, repeated matter-of-factly: the date, the place, the cause. The distance between those two sets of data is where the real story lives. It is in the years that do not fit on a poster or in a bullet point. It is in the small, unspectacular decisions of a young woman trying to be happy in a world that kept translating that word into useful. There is a kind of comfort, for the audience, in thinking of her as a lesson. Don't do drugs. Don't chase fame. Don't pose for magazines. It makes the danger sound containable, the problem solvable at the level of individual morality. But Elisa's life resists that simplification. She did not die because she caused a scandal or flew too close to the sun. She died because, after the spotlight moved on, there was a long stretch of ordinary days in which no one was tasked with making sure she made it through the night. The rectangle that first introduced her to the world was a product with a distribution plan and a marketing budget. The human being it showed was, in the end, on her own. Before her name became a line on a coroner's form, there were the kinds of days that never make it into any official record, the in-between days. Mornings when she woke up in an apartment that still smelled faintly of someone else's perfume from the night before because the place was sublet in overlapping waves. Afternoons spent driving across the valley in a sun-baked car with the air conditioning half broken, trying to get to a casting call on time. Evenings where she agreed to show up at a club because there was a promise, half serious, that a producer might be there. None of those hours appear in the narrative summaries of her life. They are just the lived cost of trying to stay close enough to the center of the picture that you might accidentally get picked up in the frame. In those rooms, The rectangles multiplied. Polaroids tacked to casting office walls, updating agents' memories of what she currently looked like. Videotapes labeled with her name sitting on shelves beside 100 others in production houses where nobody had time to watch them twice. Postcards she signed for fans at conventions. Her image reduced further to fit a 6x4 format. The same smile replicated until it became muscle memory. Every new rectangle promised, implicitly, that this one might be the one that changed everything. None of them did. What they did change, slowly and almost invisibly, was the balance between who she was when the camera was on and who she was when it was not. Friends from that period remember contradictions. The girl who could walk into a room full of strangers in a tiny dress because she had done it 100 times for work. And the same girl sitting on the edge of a bathtub at a house party, staring at the floor, overwhelmed by the volume and the closeness and the feeling that everyone expected her to perform a version of herself she didn't always recognize. The woman who could joke on stage about men's fantasies and then go home and eat dinner alone in front of the TV. Exhausted by being the punchline and the setup every night. The gap between those two selves widened with every booking, every cancellation, every time someone said, "I know you from somewhere," and she had to decide whether to admit the source. None of this is unique to her, and that is part of the point. The machine that turned Elisa Bridges into a centerfold was very good at producing images and very bad at producing infrastructure around the people inside them. Mental health support was something you were expected to sort out yourself, if you even knew how to name what you were feeling. Financial planning was a brochure you might or might not pick up in a bank. Not a built-in part of the contract that paid you to be naked at 21 and left you to figure out how to pay your bills at 27. "You're an adult," the system said, as if adulthood were a shield rather than a set of vulnerabilities with better outfits. If you zoom out from her specific case and look at the pattern, a grim checklist emerges. Sudden but shallow fame in early adulthood. Work that revolves around the body. A professional identity tied to youth and desirability rather than skill sets that can deepen with age. An industry that treats girls as infinitely replaceable because, in business terms, they are. Add to that the easy availability of substances that take the edge off anxiety and insomnia and self-doubt, and you have an environment where the line between coping mechanism and self-destruction is gossamer thin. When something goes wrong, it is always possible to point to individual choices. It is much harder and more uncomfortable to ask why those choices keep clustering in the same kinds of lives. In the years since Elisa died, people have written think pieces about Playboy, about the mansion, about the culture that made an empire out of the promise of access to women's bodies. They have debated whether it was liberating or exploitative, whether the women were empowered participants or victims. The truth, as always, lives in the gray space in between. A centerfold could be a ladder for one woman and a trapdoor for another. Sometimes it was both for the same person, just at different points on the timeline. What is striking, looking back, is not how scandalous the pictures now seem. In an era of ubiquitous explicit content, they appear almost quaint, but how little attention was paid to the human beings once the month printed above their names had turned over. Imagine, for a moment, a different file existing somewhere in a drawer, parallel to the glossy archive, not the one with her photo credit and measurements, but one that charted other data points. Number of times she went to an audition and was asked to do something she wasn't comfortable with. Number of times she left anyway. Number of nights she lay awake worrying about money. Number of people she could realistically call at 3 in the morning if she needed help. That file would tell you far more about her chances of reaching 40 than any layout ever could. It does not exist. Nobody was paid to compile it. The industry has never been set up to think of those numbers as part of the cost of doing business. When her name appears now, it is usually as part of a list. Models gone too soon. Playmates who died young. Content formatted for clicks rather than comprehension. A thumbnail, a couple of paragraphs, the same facts rearranged. The rectangle shrinks again, this time into the size of a phone screen. Users scroll past, perhaps lingering for a second on the symmetry of the dates. 1973, 2002, and then their feeds move on. The machines that replaced the magazine have become more efficient at distributing images and no better at holding on to meaning. The lives behind the pictures remain, as ever, background noise in a culture that insists it is just giving people what they want. Perhaps the most unsettling part of her story is how easy it is to imagine a version where she survives, where nothing catastrophic happens on that particular night in Benedict Canyon, where she wakes up with a headache and another chance to try again. In that alternate timeline, there is no headline, no obituary, no reason for anyone outside her immediate circle to remember her name. She drifts a little longer, maybe picks up a steady job outside the industry, maybe finds a small apartment far from the hills and the clubs, maybe tells the occasional funny story about that one time I was in a magazine to people who weren't born when December 1994 hit the stands. In that version, her life would be considered unremarkable by the standards of celebrity culture. And that, in a way, is the quiet mercy most people are granted. But we do not live in that version. We live in the one where she did not get the extra morning. And so Elisa Bridges stays pinned to that narrow slice of time between the centerfold and the coroner's report, between the first rectangle and the last. The temptation is to treat that narrowness as the whole story, to define her entirely by the way she was marketed and the way she died. The harder, more necessary task is to see the space in between those rectangles as the real subject. The years when she was neither rising star nor tragic headline, but a human being moving through rooms, trying to make enough sense of the world to feel, if only for a moment, like just wanting to be happy was not an unreasonable request. The story would be easier to file away if it were only about one magazine in one era. It is not. The rectangles have simply changed format. What was once a glossy page is now a glowing screen that fits in the palm of a hand. Young women still learn, early, that being seen can feel like a way out of whatever small life they were born into. They still discover, often too late, that visibility is not the same as safety. Platforms measure attention in clicks and likes instead of newsstand sales. But the underlying calculation remains the same. Your value peaks when you are most consumable, not when you are most human. Somewhere, right now, another girl is rehearsing the same sentence Elisa used to say, "I just want to be happy." She is being told that happiness is synonymous with followers, with engagement, with brand deals. She is stepping into her own set of rectangles, trusting that the world that craves her image will have some plan for the rest of her life. She will not know, until much later, how few people are formally responsible for what happens when the numbers go down. The first time most people saw Elisa Bridges, they met a fantasy. The last time anyone saw her, they met the aftermath of a system that knows how to launch people and has never really bothered to learn how to land them. Somewhere between those two rectangles lies a question that the industry and the culture around it keeps refusing to answer. If a person's value is measured almost entirely in how intensely we look at them for a brief, profitable moment, what, exactly, do we think we owe them once we've all looked away?